On the Healthy Human Revolution podcast, Dr. Lori Marbus interviews nutrition and lifestyle medicine experts and extraordinary guests whose informative and inspiring stories will empower you with the knowledge to transform your life and health.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Marbus, and today I'm honored to have Simon Hill from Plant Proof. How are you today? Or this morning, I should say.
Yes. It's Monday morning here in Sydney. I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. I've really been looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Well, thank you. I think it's such a delight to always connect with people across different continents and just getting a different perspective and a different culture, even though you think would have a lot in similar. I was reading about in your book, and I was even surprised that the Australians, their life expectancy is longer than in the United States. So I think there's some interesting things that are occurring there that maybe we should look into. But getting to, your story, can you tell us a little bit about your past? I know you have you walk through working with athletes, and then that your brother kind of led you to, and your dad had some input into your looking for healthier options. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So I am a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist. I did a master's in nutrition. And I guess today I spend most of my time helping educate people around what healthy food choices look like. And I made changes personally to my own diet around a little bit more than 6 years ago now. And you're right, it was my brother who sort of pointed me in the right direction, and off I went down a rabbit hole. But really the initial seed for me that was planted and very much gave me the inspiration to dive deep into the research was an experience that I had when I was 15 with my father. And we grew up as a family in Melbourne, which is in the sort of southeast part of Australia. And we we grew up sort of on the outskirts of Melbourne at the sort of footsteps of the hills in a wine district called the Yarra Valley. And quite often we would spend Sundays driving through this wine district, and we would pick different wineries and go in and get to know the winemaker and learn about their craft. And it wasn't so much about the wine, like I was 15. It was more spending time with my dad and my brother, and we'd often take our dog, and we had an old MGB convertible, and it was just fun.
Mhm.
And on this one particular Sunday, I was with my dad. It was only us. My brother was off doing something else. And we had spent the afternoon at a couple of different wineries, and we were heading back home to have dinner and prepare dinner. And dad started to get some chest pain on that drive home. And I could see that he was slightly grimacing and he was just not comfortable. And so we had a chat, and I asked him if he was okay, and he said that he was getting some weird sort of pain in his chest area, but he thought it was okay. And we proceeded to drive home, and we cooked dinner and had dinner, and dad reassured me that everything was okay at this time again, and I actually headed off to bed. So it kind of just seemed like, something rather minor, nothing major, nothing to be concerned by. And I didn't really think too much of it until I heard some noise in the kitchen a few hours later, and some loud enough to sort of wake me up. And I went out to see what was going on, and dad was, you know, in need of help. I could see he was on his knees, he was out of breath. By this stage, he was pale. He was actually making his way to get the phone. And so he was calling the emergency number, which in Australia is 000. And he had called them, and they asked if there was anyone else that could help describe the situation, because he was so out of breath. And I remember taking the phone and explaining to the lady on the phone what was happening and sort of what had happened, I guess, in the lead up a few hours earlier, what had taken place. And they decided, based on our location, because we were quite remote, we were a long way away from the nearest hospital, at least at that stage anyway. And this is over 15 years ago now. And so they said, look, based on what you're describing, we feel like we need to send a helicopter and take your dad to the nearest hospital as fast as possible. And so they did. And they got there very quickly. And before I knew it, he was attached to oxygen. He was having all his vital signs checked, and scooped him up off the floor, put him on a stretcher, took him into the helicopter. And I couldn't fit in the helicopter. So they said to me, there's an ambulance coming by road, and you can trail in that to the hospital. And I probably should add, I've skipped over the fact that my dad was 41 at this time. So he wasn't, old by any standard. And, and in fact, this was completely coming out of the blue. He was, for all intents and purposes, on the outside, a healthy young dad. He had two young boys. He wasn't considerably overweight. Perhaps he was holding a little bit of extra body fat, but nothing crazy. He was representative of a young Australian dad. He would exercise, a few times throughout the week and try and keep active, but he was probably overworked and trying to make ends meet. And so I trailed to the hospital, and by that time I called my mother and brother, who were staying. We had two houses, so one that was in the country and one that was in the city, and they were in the city. And so they drove to meet us, and that that waiting period felt like a long time because we really didn't know what was happening. And whether dad was going to survive, and if he was, what was his health going to look like going forward. And the doctor came out to speak to us, and you know very thankfully Western medicine saved his life. And if it wasn't for that helicopter and the immediate emergency care that he received, then that may not have been the case. And he was having a heart attack, and they were able to stabilize him, and they were able to essentially ensure that he was able to have a second chance at life, which is not the case for many people who are in that circumstance, which I didn't know at the time, but I've since come to learn. And so at this time, I think it was about a day later, the doctor, the main doctor that was in charge of looking after my dad, sat us down as a family and spoke to us, and particularly to my brother and I, having taken dad's history and realizing that his dad had also had a heart attack, in fact multiple heart attacks. Albeit his were when he was in his 60s or older. And he said to my brother and I that, and this is not bad advice in itself, he said, as we get older, we should be cautious and get screened, and just be aware that this disease runs in families. And I say that that's not bad advice, because it is true that they do run in families, but the conversation kind of ended there. And I wish that the conversation had have gone further, in hindsight, because for many years I was left feeling as though, well, all families have certain genetic fates, and mine is, we have weak genes when it comes to our hearts. And if my dad had a heart attack at age 41, then and for all intents and purposes he was living a typical Australian lifestyle that I was also growing up living, then why would my fate be any different?
Yeah, absolutely. So my biological father had his first heart attack at 38 and I was 18. and my mom's dad died at 46. So I was also given a very similar
Mm.
message. Granted, I was a female, which made it a little bit less tenuous, but it is all the more concerning. You're just kind of like, okay, what do I do?
Mm.
This is the way it is, right? When you're a teenager, that's just kind of what you take. And that's when you're given that message. So that is frightening. Is your brother older or younger?
He's older, so he's 2.5, nearly 3 years older.
Gotcha. So then tell us a little bit, was that what prompted you maybe to go into kind of that field of health? Or what was that something else that led you down to become the career choice that you chose?
Well, my dad is a doctor, and
Mm.
for you know, as long as I can remember coming home, I would just see study after study piled on the coffee table or in the kitchen or in his car or overflowing out of his bag. He's been involved in the academic side of research, particularly looking at uh, arteries and vasculature in general and diabetes. So
Wow.
I've been surrounded by research and science from as long as I can remember. And so going through high school, science was something that I was naturally drawn to. And I knew when I finished high school and went to university, I would do something in the field of science. And I did very well in high school, but not quite well enough to do medicine at University of Melbourne. And I was accepted into medicine in Tasmania,
Oh, wow.
which is uh, it's a beautiful state of Australia. But at the time, as an 18-year-old in Melbourne, I was playing a lot of football. I had very close friendships, and I wasn't willing to leave Melbourne.
Mm.
And so I opted to do physiotherapy in Melbourne, which is still a very science-based course. And so I did 4 years of that and graduated. Did a research-based honors there, and that was when I got a taste for research myself and conducting a study and writing a thesis and whatnot. And yeah, sort of off I went from there into working as a clinician, as a physiotherapist, and that's how I began my career.
So the equivalent of a physiotherapist in Australia, is that the same as a physical therapist or exercise therapy? And what would be the equivalent here in the US? Do you know?
I
Not
think it
sure.
probably I'm not 100% sure on the curriculum in the United States, but I believe it would be physical therapy.
Gotcha.
I know it's very similar to the course in the UK, the physiotherapy course there. It's a 4-year undergraduate course in Australia, and
Gotcha.
um, with a focus. I mean, it has all of the anatomy and physiology and all of that stuff, and then of course it has a focus on uh, sports injuries and rehabilitation, which was the sort of interest that I took, but also every, stroke rehabilitation and, physiotherapists work in a number of different settings.
Gotcha. Yeah, that would probably be very close to that then. Excellent. And then how did the conversation shift? What was the day that your brother said, by the way, this is what I'm doing. You should look into it.
Yeah. So when I was in my mid 20s and thought I knew everything, even about
You don't
food,
know
even
everything in your mid 20s? Darn.
and, and yeah, it's funny when as you get older, you realize you don't know everything. But in my mid 20s, I probably thought I knew everything, and my knowledge about nutrition at that stage really was formed through I was working with elite footballers in Australia, and a lot of the nutrition information I was picking up was through football culture. It was
Mm,
through gym culture. It was through fitness culture.
sure.
Uh, and I was very much influenced by that. And so it wasn't that the choices I was making and the food I was putting on my plate were supported by rigorous science, not at
Mhm,
that stage.
sure.
And so my brother, he was coming to stay with me for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and he was coming with his fiance, and a little a little while before he came, I think it was a couple of months, the first time he gave me a heads up, he gave me a call and said, "Hey, we've changed the way we're eating. I'm just letting you know for when we come up." And he was obviously figuring that I would therefore shop a little differently and perhaps look at some different restaurants to go to when they came and visited. We were living in different states, and so he said we're eating a pescatarian diet. And I've always been a very open person in terms of I'm willing to try new things, and if someone brings some form of information to me, I want to I want to understand more about it. And uh I approached that the same way. I said, "Look, that's great. uh we can eat fish, and I'll find a few different restaurants. There's some Japanese restaurants that I know of." And it didn't seem too complicated to me, to be honest.
Mm.
And so a week before he came up, he called me again,
Mm.
and he said, "Just want to let you know, we've changed the way we're eating again." I'm like, "Okay." Uh, and I initially thought he must have meant, well, I've reverted back
Mm.
to eating, all of the red meats and the dairy and the eggs and all of that. And he said, "Well, we've removed the fish." And I can remember this phone call because I was silent. I was left thinking, what on earth are we going to eat? And what on earth is he going to eat for the rest of his
Right.
life? And and you have to remember that I was heavily conditioned by those environments that I had grown up in. I was deep in those, as deep as anyone could be in terms of protein obsession, you know, this fixation on animal protein and meat is muscle, and in many cases, fearing carbohydrates, certain
Mm.
carbohydrates that I now understand are very healthful. And and so this was a lot for me to hear from him and to try and make sense of. My immediate response was, "What are you thinking?" And so I said to him, I gave him the benefit of the doubt, uh, that he was doing the right thing. And I said, "Look, well, that's okay. You're going to have to give me a little bit of a hand when we go shopping, and perhaps you can pick some restaurants." And I also already knew both he and his fiance, they love to cook.
Mm.
So I knew that it wasn't as if they were going to come up and just expect me to cook everything and look after everything. So I went along with it, and they came up, and we spent a week or so together. And my brother's not from a science background, so he
Mm.
wasn't coming to this armed with evidence and trying to convince me to change my diet or anything like that.
Mhm.
Uh, and after that week, all I remember is just being left thinking, "Wow, that food tasted incredible."
Mhm.
And it opened my eyes to the fact that there were many different foods, many different flavors that I was actually missing out on.
Mm.
And I thought, well, that I could eat more of that for sure. So I better actually start to look at the science and think about, whether or not my current diet is truly serving me. And in the back of
Mm.
my mind, the only thing my brother had said to me when I inquired about why he was changing the way that he was eating was that he had come across information that suggested reducing animal protein, eating more plant protein, more fiber, more diversity was a very, very good thing for heart health. And
Mm.
because he was recalling our earlier experience and having watched my dad's health deteriorate, and he and his wife were thinking at that stage about having kids, they have since had kids
Mm.
now. So obviously he was thinking about himself in our dad's position.
Mhm.
So he was wanting to make sure he was doing whatever he could not to end up in that same position. And so I thought, well, I better get stuck into the research, and I did, and in many ways I wanted to prove him wrong. The
Mm.
easy thing for me, the easy thing for me was going to be to show him that he was wrong. I could keep eating the steak and all the chicken breast and the simple diet that I had, which probably had three vegetables at most, which was broccoli and sweet potato or potato, uh, and and then meat. Uh, and so I started to go through the science, and it was challenging me. It was
Mm.
constantly challenging me until I really got to a point where I had to decide how important is my long-term health here.
Mm.
Am I going to stick my head in the sand and just pretend that I'm going to be young forever? And or am I going to shift my priorities here a little bit?
Mm.
And
Mm.
it became, overwhelmingly clear to me, not that a vegan or a completely plant exclusive diet was categorically the best, but what it became very clear to me was that the the people who were living the healthiest for the longest had
Mm.
different variations of a diet where all or most of calories were coming from whole plants.
Mhm.
And this was, again, very far removed from the diet that I was consuming at that time. So it was challenging, but I realized, look, I need to value my long-term health more here.
Mm.
And the next piece of the puzzle was, well, I'm prepared to do that. I am prepared to value my long-term health more if I don't have to give up anything today.
Mm.
And what that meant for me was I don't want to we none of us want to give up the joy for food, right?
For sure.
And we don't want to sacrifice flavor. Now, I'd already ticked that box because I'd had that week with my brother. And
Mm.
so I knew that that this wasn't about eating rabbit food. So I knew that, and and that was very motivating for me. But the next thing I
Mm.
needed to know was, okay, well, I have these physical endeavors, these performance endeavors,
Mm.
and I'm not prepared. And I write this in my book. Science could say that if you eat only kale, you'll live to 140 years old. But I wasn't prepared to do that because, of course, that would come at some expense with regards to your performance. So I needed to know that you could tap into these long-term health benefits. You could take control of your longer term disease risk, and at the same time maintain, or even better, improve performance.
Mm.
And so, I went down, I had all of those common questions that I believe most of us have, and particularly physically active males who
Mhm.
require a lot of calories
Mhm.
tend to have even more of these questions around protein and around muscle and around endurance and recovery, et cetera, et cetera. And I slowly had to work through all of that information. And once I had enough information to see that it was absolutely possible, I realized, well, the next step is to start giving it a go myself and to feel the personal benefits.
And how did those personal benefits turn out?
Yeah. So for me, the transition was, I guess, relatively slow. It didn't
Mm.
feel slow, but now, in hindsight and having the experience of speaking to so many people who go through this, I realize that there are certainly people that transition faster.
Mhm.
And I think it comes down to your personality.
Oh
And
yeah, for sure.
there are some people who do amazingly well on an instant transition.
We did it overnight with three
Yeah,
teenagers. That was
there you go. So
fun.
that can't be ignored. There are people that works, and that's the best route for them.
Sure.
And then there are other people where making small incremental changes and building confidence is the better sort of path. And
Mhm.
I think most people can work out based on their life experiences, which is going to be a better option for them. And so for me, it was about doing it in stages and starting small. And so I was, eating more legumes and feeling good for it. And I was cutting back down on the red meat. And some of the things that I was experiencing, I guess, in the short term was a feeling that my digestion was a little easier. I wasn't feeling so sluggish immediately after that meal. And, I remember some of the nights out, and I still say this to my close friends. We'd have these big dinners with like 10 guys and in Melbourne, and usually it was at a steakhouse. And every single time when I'd finish that steak, I would I would just feel a little sick in the stomach, like it was so heavy, and I'd feel like I needed to go to bed straight away. And so as I was cutting down on the animal protein and adding more legumes in, be it beans or chickpeas or tofu or lentils, I was immediately noticing that. And I just continued to do that. That was the main thing I was focusing on, was reduce animal protein, increase plant protein, and add a little more color and diversity to my plate at the same time. I noticed initially, and this is something that I do speak about, was that I actually lost a little bit of weight at the start, and that wasn't a goal for me. In fact, that worried me. I think it speaks to the incredible advantage of a plant-based diet in a world where we live in an obesogenic environment, and we have an excess of calories and these hyperpalatable ultra processed foods. I think it's an enormous advantage. What had happened was I'd removed a lot of very calorie dense foods, and I just hadn't added enough volume to my plate to be consuming the same amount of calories. But I was quickly able to work that out, and because my goal was not to lose weight, I was able to work around that. And that gave me confidence in and of itself, that hey, I can actually tweak things here and maintain my weight or gain weight, if that was someone's goal. For example, someone wanting to build muscle and increase strength. And so this period of transitioning and making these changes to my plate, it was a meal by meal, week by week type play for me. I didn't put a whole lot of pressure on myself. I remember still eating out with friends at that stage, and sometimes at that stage I'd choose the plant-based option while I was out, and other times I wouldn't, depending what was on the menu. But over a period of sort of 6, maybe 9 months, I had fully transitioned, and I'd built a lot of confidence with what I was doing. And by that time I was only eating plants, and it's been that way ever since.
Awesome. That's a huge one. I went to plant-based diet about 9.5 years ago, and and I live in Colorado, so it's kind of like the Wild West. Like kind of a little bit of Texas and Western Colorado. I live on the east side now towards Denver, but I just gotten out of the military, the Air Force, and we'd settled in Rifle, Colorado. And I'd been there about 1.5 years. And I had a patient come in one day and say meat and dairy upset her stomach. I said, well, stop eating meat and dairy, knowing full well there were plenty of other plants. I grew up in a home that didn't have a lot of means, so we ate a lot of plants growing up. So I was kind of fortunate in that sense. So I knew she'd be fine. We lived in a place that didn't offer junk food vegan restaurants at the time, definitely back then. And she came back in 30 days, but she brought her daughter with her, which is really interesting. Made her miss school. She was 16. I thought, well, what did she do to have her mom pull her out of school to come to her mother's appointment? She goes, now you tell Dr. Marbus what you did. I was like, oh, what'd you do? And she said, well, I went on this diet with my mom to support her, and I felt so good, Dr. Marbus. I stopped both my ADD meds. I was like, what? I was like, that's freaking awesome. She goes, yeah. Her mom goes, why was she able to do that? Not in a manner of being angry, but in a sense of like, why didn't you tell me this? Or why didn't the doctor who started this meds on her years ago mentioned this, and it was simple as changing your diet. So literally, we just got into a deep conversation of what they ate, and the light started slowly, a little dense sometimes. So the light came on, and I immediately Googled, what was ADD in plants, and China study came up, and then it
Mm,
just took me down the rabbit hole. And within 2 weeks, I had a lupus patient we did another little experiment with, and I went home one night and said, "Family, this is what we're doing," and threw it all out. And husband lost 70 pounds. My kids were 13, 15, and 18 at the time. So over a period of time, they chose, at home we eat plants, but going out, they ate what they wanted. But over time, they're all plant-based now, and one's um, a doctor now. So, but
incredible.
yeah, it was quite a story. There's some fun stories in there in the mix of all that and the craziness. But
Mm,
it's hard to come and know how to do this as a physician, especially back then. There wasn't a whole lot of resources. So I was blessed with really nice patients who were very patient with me and ended up doing a lot of different things, a lot of right things, a lot of wrong things. They were very good to point those out to me. So I understand that transitional time, but it's such a blessing, especially as you get older. At this age, especially, you're just kind of like, so I'll be 51 in October, and I'm just sitting here going, what would have 51 been, 10 years without this? Not that I was overweight or had a lot of
I
health
can't
issues,
believe
but
you're 50. You're nearly
I'll be
51.
51 and
You look, you, you legitimately look in your mid 30s.
I blessed you. I'll pay you later. No, my daughter's 27. The kids are 27,
Gosh.
25, and 23, almost 23.
Wow.
But yeah, it was, but it is, it's been the truest blessing. And that's why we launched Plant-Based Health, my business partner and I, and we're in all 50 states providing lifestyle medicine, and we've been at it for about 16, 18 months now. And what an incredible thing. We've grown from just myself and Anthony, who was the business partner, who lost 160 pounds on a plant-based diet, to 8 doctors now, including Dr. Clapper. And it just keeps growing. So it's been a lot of fun to be able to offer this to everyone in the United States. We do have some international patients, but mostly in the United States. But that's just, it's a pretty cool thing to be able to now to share the ripple effects of like your work on a broad scale. I mean, so what was the impetus for starting the podcast and going from there?
Well, I was getting asked a lot of the same questions.
I know
And
that feeling.
and and initially it was closed circle of friends, and then it was people within the fitness industry, gym, football, coming to me who had heard what I was doing, but I wasn't being very public about my transition or the way I was eating. It
Mm.
was more other people talking and and saying, go and speak to Simon about this. And uh so I realized I needed to centralize some information, which was the initial, I guess, inspiration for using social media. I hadn't been a big social media user before that. Uh, and so that was a learning curve. The podcast, though, was about learning, both myself and the guests. What a great opportunity to sit down with people from different walks of life with different
Mhm,
experiences, who have either been in the lab conducting science or treating patients, and seeing
mhm,
how this plays out in the day to day. So getting different perspectives on health and trying to explore some of the nuance that exists. And I think a big thing for me was frustration with headlines, and
mm,
realizing how easy it is for people to be confused. And I realized that, at least for the people that the small amount of people in the world that I would reach, a big thing that is important for me is to give them information so they are sort of immunized against that misinformation,
mhm.
and they just feel more confident in
Right.
in the changes that they're making. And the next time the news headline changes, they don't feel derailed, like they have to
Mhm,
give up on everything. And so I think podcast allows, in this longer format, allows us to discuss some of that nuance. It's not
mhm,
all completely black or white. And unfortunately, when everything's made black or white, we end up with, headlines that can flip and change
mm,
and be very confusing. So that was that was the inspiration behind that. And then, over time, I realized that I should probably try and put this down into a book, and maybe that will be something that people want to read.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like they are. So tell us a little bit about the book. And it's a great book, guys, by the way. You should definitely get it. In the United States, it'll be available November 1st that you had mentioned, but I got the Kindle version. So it's certainly um, easy to get from that standpoint. But can you show, or Book Depository, I guess would be the other one if you want to get a physical
Yeah.
book here in the US. But as far as tell us about the book and what that experience is like and going from there.
Yeah, so the book, I spent 3 years in the actual writing process. I did that with Penguin, who were an enormous help in helping me shape it and pull it together. It
Mm.
essentially has three parts. The first part is what I called Diet of Confusion, which is why the confusion exists and what are the sources of that confusion. And if we look at a sort of typical diet, it's very low in fiber, it's high in ultra processed foods, and around 70 to 85% of protein in the typical diet is coming from animal protein. And so what I'm encouraging people to do is, based on the science, it's very obvious we need to flip that on its head as best as possible. And we need to be getting all or most of our protein from plants. We want to be reducing our consumption of ultra processed foods, and we want to be consuming a diet that's rich in fiber. And when we're doing that, we are adopting this theme of eating, which is time and time again shown to produce great health today, but also great health for longer. And so diet of confusion is looking at the food industry and how is our food environment shaped
Mhm.
that is leading us to this current diet that is failing us
Mhm.
and is so detrimental to our health. And when we understand what those sources are, we can then better navigate the food environment.
Mhm.
And then the second part of the book is looking more at the more common diseases, chronic diseases that we're faced with, and also longevity, what science exists that is looking at food choices and how long we live. And then part three of the book is more of the practical information. So, okay, you're wanting to add more plants to your plate. What information do you need to do that in a way where it is adequately planned? You're getting all of the nutrition you need. So your focus nutrients of focus are covered. You're protecting your long-term health. You're feeling great and you're feeling confident. And so that's the three parts of the book. And yeah, so far I've been getting some nice messages. So uh, I believe it's sort of landing well with people.
Absolutely, very well. And so, if you have someone come to you who's a newcomer, what is the typical advice that you give to them besides read the book? What would be something that you would recommend as far as getting started? And when you said well planned, looking at the nutrients of concern, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so in the book I called them nutrients of focus. I thought
Focus,
it was
sorry.
I thought it was a slightly more positive spin on
Yes,
nutrients of concern,
fair
but
enough.
you're right. Nutrients of concern is the common way to describe those. Uh, I think it really depends on where that person's coming from.
Mm,
And so if there's someone that is coming to me and they're like, look, what's the first step? Like what's the next step that I should take? And they're literally adopting an ultra processed standard American diet, as I said before, that is rich in animal protein. I want them to focus on more on what they're adding, and so I will talk to them about the fact that science shows fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. These are health promoting foods we want to be consuming more of. I want more
mm,
of those in your diet. And so it will be focusing more on what they're adding, knowing that as they're adding those foods, which are very satiating, they will naturally crowd out the ultra processed foods and hopefully some of that animal protein.
mm,
And depending on where that person is, it may just be focusing on one meal. It could be, look, working out what they have for breakfast and saying, I think a good starting point for you is making sure you're having 2 pieces of fruit every breakfast.
Mhm.
And 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 this is, if you read any of the habit books in terms of
Mhm.
forming new habits, it is advantageous to start small and build
Mhm.
incrementally from there. So that's one thing I would discuss. The other would be simple swaps, because there are some simple swaps that people can make that really reduce that sense of being overwhelmed. And
Mhm.
so it might be that, I know I had a friend the other day, he called me and he said that, and this is after many years of him listening to my podcast and never changing anything in his diet. He said, after listening to over 100 episodes and and
Just 100.
having gifted him a book, he said, just tell me one thing to do. And he eats a lot of red meat.
Mm.
He eats red meat probably 4 to 5 times a week.
Wow.
I said to him, I said, "Okay, one thing to do is your your red meat consumption needs to go down, ideally." I said to him, "No more than twice a week, red meat, and on all those other nights where you have red meat, you're going to choose a legume to replace it.
Mhm.
Lentils,
Mhm.
chickpeas, black beans, tofu, tempeh, whatever it is, that's what you're going to do." And so he has started on that path,
Mhm.
and that's has been a simple thing for him to focus on. One thing,
Right.
one swap, and all he has to do is think about, okay, it's Tuesday night. Normally I'd have red meat. Okay, tonight I'm going to do lentils instead.
Mm.
And where possible, I've told him to not super complicate things with big fancy recipes, because he's a time poor guy. His spaghetti bolognese, I said, just keep the recipe essentially the same. We're just going to add lentils. I'll, I'll show you how to cook them. Or you can buy the canned ones, and they're already soaked and cooked. You just have to heat them up.
Mhm.
But you can spice them if you want to make them add a bit of flavor. Uh, and then that's a nice easy way for him to get these foods into his diet without feeling overwhelmed.
Mhm.
Uh, but on that note, I guess seasoning and spices is something that I also talk to people about.
Mm.
We depending on how we've grown up, I know for me personally, the animal protein was the hero of the plate, and the vegetables was very much an afterthought.
Mhm.
And as a result, those vegetables didn't taste great.
Mhm.
And so they were always the last thing that I ate, if I ate them at all. And just explaining this idea to people that, herbs and spices and condiments, these bring a lot of flavor to our meals.
Mhm.
and and if someone eats chicken, usually they marinate that chicken, they do something with that chicken to bring flavor, right?
Mhm.
And so if you're cooking with tofu for the first time, something I often hear is, tofu is very bland. and and look, if the first time you have tofu is straight out of the packet, and you haven't cooked it in any spices or herbs or turmeric or paprika or cumin or things like that, then, or onion and garlic at least, then yes, it can taste a little like nothing. But in fact, the fact that tofu tastes like nothing and is a bit of a sponge is actually really advantageous.
Mhm.
Uh, so to summarize that, starting small, it might be focusing on one meal a day for someone. It could be focusing on just a simple swap throughout the week, like red meat for lentils, for example, and then remembering spices and seasonings so that when you're adding these new foods in, they still taste great.
I remember. So when I first switched this over, the kids, I went to medical school. My kids were, we got married out of college. I stayed home for 6 years, had 3 kids under 4. And then I started medical school when they were 5, 3, and 10 months. My daughter and I started medical school and kindergarten the same day. And so I was always short on time. I was active duty military after that. So I was like, listen, you guys are going to eat what I cook or you'll eat the next meal. You'll be fine. That's how I was raised. And it worked out okay. But when we got started switching over, I always gave them the opportunity to give me thumbs up or thumbs down. And it was really funny because they rejoiced in the fact if they could just like kind of stick it to me like, Mom, this was not good. So I just took it upon myself as like, oh, you know what? But there's going to be a meal here that's so good. You can't give me a thumbs down. You'll at least give me a thumbs, whatever, And so I took that as a challenge and it really became quite a spectacle. But tofu was one of those things. Once I figured out it was just a conduit of taste, really, it was the spices that really lent to the fun of the meal. And we made some good friends with a good chef that lived in Aspen, Colorado. And my husband ate his meal and he goes, oh, I can do this the rest of my life. And I was like, okay, I can cook like this. I can. And, but you're right, that just finding the joy of cooking and making sure we raise our kids like this. And they have cooking skills, at least the basics, like boiling water and putting some lentils in a pot, those things are super helpful with Instapots now, but, that's amazing. So that I understand where we are in the United States. I know where we are with our plant-based culture and movement. How's it in Australia? How do you feel like comparatively? Is it stagnant? Is it growing? What do you see changing there?
I think the interest is certainly growing. I'm also very conscious that there are pockets and bubbles.
Mm,
And so a bit like America, there's LA and New York and various cities, more than that, but there are various cities in America that are, I guess, more progressive in
mhm,
terms of adopting more plant-based approaches. So in Australia, there are certainly pockets. There are cities where you're seeing, many more plant-based restaurants. We're also seeing a real increase in plant-based, I guess, alternative products. Some
mm,
good, some bad. I have mixed feelings on some of those, but I think overall they are making it much easier. So I lean more on the side that, by and large, most of them are doing are adding value. Particularly like plant-based milks in Australia that are now getting much better at fortifying with calcium and vitamin D and vitamin B12,
mm,
which I think is really important.
mhm.
Uh, and and I think just in general conversation, I think people are, at least in my circles, are really beginning to understand the the benefits that are up for grabs and the power of eating more whole plants, uh, but equally that it can taste great. I think that's a big thing that's changing. Is this, we've been told to eat more fruits and vegetables for a long time, but
Mhm,
it has sounded rather boring. And I think where we're making some inroads is people understanding that it doesn't have to be boring. And you can jump on social media now and see all these incredible plant-based
oh
recipes,
my
and
goodness,
it's
it's
so
amazing.
obvious that, hey, you can do this and you don't have to give up anything. And so I
Mhm,
think that that is a big sort of, the pennies dropping there.
mm.
uh, and that just makes it so much more attractive for people to give it a go.
Yeah, absolutely. And you spoke of, and that's just honestly, that's building habits. I got BJ Fogg, who wrote Tiny Habits, on the podcast because I started my podcast in 2016 because honestly, I wanted just to send patients. So I was like, okay, here's this story. So if I interview them, I could just say, go listen to this one. It'll inspire you. But then it just got to be actually kind of a selfish endeavor to meet awesome people such as yourself. And I was like, now I just enjoy talking to people.
Yeah.
But the tiny habit component of that is so important, right? Is just understanding that if you can just make one dish taste delicious, you can grow on that. But the
Mm.
the Google thing, I tell my patients, they're like, well, what should I eat? I was like, but let me tell you what you're going to do. You type in whatever you have in the fridge, whatever you're hungry for, and then you say plant-based, whatever, and you go through. Google pops up all these recipes. I pick the ones that have all 5-star ratings and I've yet to be let down. And so simple as that. And so the internet's an amazing, incredible tool.
Yeah, I love him. I've got his book here actually up on the shelf.
Yeah.
Uh, Great book for anyone that wants to learn
Oh.
more about building habits. And I think as well, one of the big things he talks about is effort. If you're building something in a new habit, you don't want it to require too much effort. It should be nice
Mhm,
and simple,
mhm,
which again speaks to what we're saying about starting small and getting some of those easy wins on board.
Yes, and because one of the main thing too, as a physician, I'm just a family medicine physician, and when you start looking at how can I convince someone to go on a plant-based diet, I had to think differently. I feel like I'm a salesman. Like I have to be a better salesman than the McDonald's down the street or the Burger King or whatever is the cheap meal at the current restaurant. But that the tiny habits. I took actually his boot camp, and so I got to spend 4 weeks with him. As I'm trying to absorb as much as possible, I feel like I need to be the starting point for someone. I can hold their hand along the way, but they got to do it. But I also have to give them the tools, and so that's really important that I feel adequate to do that. And
Mm.
I learned so much. It was only 12 of us for 4 hours every Friday for an entire month last summer. And what a blessing that was. It was such an incredible learning experience. But yes, and there's so much. I draw out the fog model. I describe it to patients. I'm doing telemedicine. I'm like, look at this. This is where you are. This is your action line. And they really, it's like an aha moment when people understand they're not a victim of their current circumstances. They can actually change their habits. And it's actually not as difficult as we make it out to be. Sometimes it is, but not always. But that's fun.
That's
Amazing.
right. And
Yeah.
once it becomes, once these things become, I guess, second nature,
Mm,
a bit like when you get in your car and you put your seatbelt on.
right.
You,
Right.
the nice thing is once they become habits and it is second nature, it requires very little sort of energy from our brain, and it frees us up to think about other things. So something else I try and explain to people is, early on it can seem like you have to focus on quite a bit. Let's simplify that so you're only focusing on little things. But trust me, as you build more confidence and these move from very conscious actions to unconscious, then just like you would eat now and how I eat now, it's not something that we're you know using an incredible amount of brain power on every day.
No, honestly, it's funny. I did a mission trip to Africa for 2 weeks in rural Africa. I ate this way. I've been all over the country eating this way, and I have patients who've traveled to all interesting places in the world and eat this way. So it can be done. It's just a matter of planning. But you're exactly right. Honestly, I can't remember. I know I ate differently, but now it's like I don't remember wanting to eat that way. Now I just like now this is all I want because I feel so good. I'm exercise, I run, I'm an active mom. Oh, they're out of the house now, but those type of things are it's just such a joy to be this way now. I can't imagine not being this way. So I get it. It's a wonderful thing. So I know, Simon, we're coming up on our hour mark. I really appreciate all your time. Is there any last bit of advice you'd like to share with our audience, or anything you like, any messaging or anything like that you'd like to share, and where they can find you also on social media?
I think if someone's listening and perhaps they're in their 20s or 30s, sometimes this information, it can be hard to connect with and feel a strong enough why or reason to change your diet, unless of course you have experienced poor health yourself, or like me, seen someone in your family experience poor health. But
Mhm.
there, in my experience in speaking with people who are 20s or 30s or even younger, who don't have that sort of compelling reason, it can be a little more challenging to want to prioritize long-term health.
Mhm.
And that comes back to this whole idea of instant gratification versus delayed gratification, and how do we get people to care more about something in the long term. And two things I would want to leave people with there is, one, I hope that we've made it clear in this conversation that prioritizing your health long term does not mean you have to give up the joy and love for food today. You can absolutely maintain that. In fact, you can have more of it. I'm sure of it.
Oh, yes.
And the second is, don't wait for pain. Don't
Mhm.
wait for pain to make these changes, uh, because by then it may well be too late. And if we just continue to live our lifestyle that's the same as everyone around us, and are ingesting the same food for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner, the same snacks, how can we expect a different result? We
Mhm.
can't. We could pray that we are an outlier and we're the 97-year-old grandmother who smoked and had a horrible diet and lived until 97. And while that's possible, it's not probable. So my main message is just for people to understand that we have so much more power than we're often led to believe, and hopefully you can start today, start making small changes, and I'm sure you'll never look back.
Absolutely. And, I would say to that as well is that honestly, the patients that I see, I have patients as young as 4 or 5 type 1 diabetics to, I mean, I've had over 100 patients, but when they don't understand what normal is. I feel like normal is, we've forgotten what it's like to be a healthy, normal human being without chronic disease. And I like, chronic disease is actually not normal, guys. And so when they get a touch of it by feeding their body well, resting, exercise, all these incredible things, and there's simple changes, it's like, they're like, this is what it's like to be normal and feel well. I was like, yes. And so that joy is so, just wells up, and it's amazing. So you're exactly right. And as far as social media, where can people find you?
So I am on Instagram and Twitter at plant_proof. That's probably the best place to find me.
Awesome. And everyone check out the book. The proof is in the plants. It's absolutely exactly right. Everything that you read there will be amazing and phenomenal. You did a wonderful job. So thank you for putting that out there for people as a resource. And we thank you for your work on your podcast and being such a delight to speak to. And this was a real joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'd love to have you on my show sometime soon too.
Oh, that would be an honor. Thank you I would love that. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video. Before you go though, please hit the subscribe button and the alert button so you will be notified whenever we upload any new videos. On Monday, we upload the Healthy Human Revolution podcast. Now, if you'd rather listen to the podcast, you can find it on all the major platforms such as iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and even Spotify. On Tuesdays, we upload the Doctor's In. This is where I answer your questions. Thinking of that, could you please comment below any questions you might have about health or wellness or any topics that you would like me to cover? Now, if you're looking for more resources on how to start a plant-based diet, sustain a plant-based diet, exercise, recipes, anything regarding wellness, we've got you covered. Check out healthyhumanrevolution.com. And again, thanks for watching.